Hey guys, I'm Kate. Welcome back to my channel, and it turns out that I'm not the only one on AuthorTube who's co-writing a story. When I mentioned that in my most recent goals video, I was saying that we were struggling with it a little bit, me and my co-writer. There were several people in the comment section who were like, I'm co-writing a story too. But there are also several people who aren't yet co-writing a story but have been kind of sort of thinking about it. So that's what this video is going to be about today, kind of, you know, commiserating with other co-writers and also celebrating how awesome co-writing a story is, and hopefully like some pros and cons and how to or how not to co-write a story for those of you who want to try it but just haven't yet. So let's get into it. By the way, this is one of my 2018 goals that's also a carryover from my 2017 goals, so that could maybe indicate either how far along me and my co-writer are or aren't, just so you know. This of course is all through the lens of someone who's kind of struggling with it themselves, so I have a lot of lessons learned, and I am excited to say, semi-definitively, that as of this moment, I think we really truly do have a system that works for us. I also thought that a month ago, but this one makes more sense to me now, so who knows? And maybe that's just part of the first tip or thing that you need to do, but it is the most important one, which is that communication is key. And communication is key in all relationships, but especially work relationships. And even more especially writing work relationships. So before you go into co-writing a story with anyone, friend or otherwise, you need to discuss 4 things with each other. The first one is how much work you can both put in. The second one is the timetable for getting the project done. The third one is how you'll bring up story-related issues or personal work relationship ones. How are you going to talk about when you have a disagreement and or if the situation is no longer working for you and you need something to change in order to continue. And finally, the fourth one is how you're going to divide the work. I'm gonna assume that before you even start co-writing a story, you and the person you're kind of talking to about it, or the one that you kind of joked about doing this with, you guys have an understanding of what kind of story it would be. And that's super important because if you don't like the same kind of stories, if y'all don't read in the same genres, if you don't write in the same genres, if nothing is the same, do not be co-writers. I mean that so seriously. You know, maybe you've never written a romance novel before, but you're like, well, I like romance novels. You need that, okay? You need to enjoy the same kind of thing. You need to enjoy whatever the book is that you're going to be writing. So just because you found someone that you enjoy who's also a writer doesn't mean that you should jump into co-writing a story with them. Like, just don't do it. Don't. But that also leads me into my second warning, because while I think that you guys need to like the same kind of stories, you can't be the same kind of writers. You need complementary skills, talents, taste, not the exact same. Otherwise, it's never gonna work. For me personally, my ideal writing partner is probably someone who excels at world building and description, because that is something that I routinely struggle with and have to go back and add in to later drafts. If I worked with someone who genuinely liked that and was genuinely good at that from the beginning, that would save us so much time. But if I have someone like me who doesn't really do much world building to start and also doesn't write description, like, it's just, oh buddy. This is also similar for work ethic, and I don't mean it in the way that like one of you is lazy and one of you's not. I just mean that if you both prefer the world building and the character bios and the things that aren't the writing, it's like that weird bystander effect where you both need to write the words, but you both want to talk about the running themes that you're going to weave into the story. You know, like you can't both have trouble pushing yourself to write, because you're just gonna feed off of that energy and it's just never gonna get done. I think all of that was good words of warning or how not to co-write a story, but how do you co-write a story? And here's the thing, as soon as I figure it out, I'll let you know. No, I actually think that's the hardest part, right? Because you can be the perfect work partners and still struggle to write the story. And I think of just how many different ways I've gotten to the conclusion of a story or written a story before, and that's just one person, you know? Like, I've tried different plotting methods, I've tried all sorts of different things, and different things work for different stories, but now you're bringing 2 people into that equation, and that makes it infinitely harder. But that also means you can do away with any idea of pantsing the novel. When you're co-writing a story, it's much more by the book and methodical, because you can't pants the novel when you're working with someone else. It just doesn't work. And I do think that you're still allowed some amount of discovery writing, because that's just how writing works, but every bit of discovery writing that you do, or every new thing that you bring in where you have an idea where you're like, oh my gosh, this could work, you have to have that conversation. You can't just start going off in one direction and not tell that to the other person. And moreover, y'all have to agree to that. Even if you think the idea is great, you need to tell the other person so they can bring in their perspective and be like, well, actually, that's not gonna work as well. Or, yeah, that's great, but what if we do this and that? Like, everything, again, is a conversation. This goes back to communication. Most important thing. How my friend and I started, we met up in person, and we live several hours away, so this isn't something that we can just do all the time. But we met up in person and we went over more or less the entire main plot. We brainstormed together, we worked on it for several hours, we were like, this is how this should happen, and this is how this should happen, and this will go into this, and we more or less had a chapter by chapter outline by the time we were done. Of course, we worked on it more separately after that, you know, kind of tinkering with the plot as we saw fit, but then we brought that conversation up again when we got to Skype with each other. And look, you're gonna plot the shit out of this novel. Once plotted, you're gonna divide the work. And that's one of the things that I said you need to discuss first before you even start writing. But now that you have the plot, you're really going to need to nail down who's gonna do which aspects of the story. And a lot of co-written stories are taken over and like one person does one point of view of the story and one person does the other. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like My Lady Jane and All American Boys. And I'm trying to think of a book that's co-written that didn't have two different point of views the story's told from, or three if there were three authors or something. And I know that there's one of them, but for the life of me, I can't think of it right now. So that's not helpful, but you know, I do think that mostly you will have split the point of views or split the narratives. And then one of you will take whichever one you decide that either you relate to more or you think you could write better than the other. Again, it's a conversation, just figure it out. And this is where scheduling is so important, especially if your story's intertwined, but you also want to keep some aspect of that discovery writing. i.e. my chapter comes after yours, but I also want to include some of what your chapter had in it. And so to like keep that cohesive narrative and continuation of the plot, me and my co-writer played around with different schedules to make sure that we could do that. And I think we finally found one that works for us, but this was after a whole bunch of trial and error. Again, we've been working on this, I think, since 2016, probably.
Yeah, I don't think it was 2015. Was it? I'm gonna have to go back and look.
What my friend, my co-writer, and I have discovered is that we're going to give each other a week after one of our chapters is, in quotes, you know, due, to get our next chapter done. Before we were doing like a chapter each week or 2 chapters a week, and something about that just led to us being more likely to fall off schedule somehow over the longevity of the project. Then it gives me the flexibility if I'm just not busy one day to finish it early, and then jump starts her week to get it done. And that keeps our momentum going, and that's just what we've decided works best for us. Again, we only recently discovered this, so play around with it. I should say one little thing really quick, which is that we work in Google Drive so that we're not emailing each other the chapters. You could email, just give each other some kind of notification that your chapter is done. That way you can jumpstart the week, or be like, hey, check this out. I need you to see something. Does this character make sense? Is what I'm doing on the right track for what you'd imagined? Do you think I'm sticking to our outline? Blah, 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 blah. And then finally, once you've written all of your individual chapters, of course you guys have to go over the editing and revising stage like any other work in progress. Because me and my co-writer took 2 different point of view characters, we made it so that their voices are a lot different. And one of the things that we have to focus on when we're going through revisions and editing is going through each other's chapters and making sure that that character sounds like they do in their point of view chapters. And it's just layering that in terms of their mannerisms, the way they speak, the way they think about certain things, etc. We've gotten better at this as time's gone along and just as we've grown as co-writers, and I think that's a skill that's learned rather than initially had. And so again, a lot of this can be trial and error, and a lot of this would be different if you had a different co-writer. Recently I pointed out that I didn't think that my character would do that my co-writer had written in her chapter because of like XYZ thing, and I gave the reasoning to my co-writer. She said that she understood that reasoning, agreed with it, and had said that she was just going off of another chapter that I had written. Then we had the conversation about why that was written in the first place. Ultimately all it was 2 lines that my co-writer changed in her chapter, but the conversation sparked an idea on a way we could emphasize something about my character going forward. And also I asked my friend and co-writer what she thought the pros and cons were, not telling her exactly what I was going to be talking about. But before I want to get to that, I want to make the point about how you should handle criticism. Oh. Like when reading anyone's writing, the criticism that you give needs to be constructive, and it also needs to be more story related. Like in the example I gave, there was a story reason that I disagreed with the way that the scene was going. I brought it up, we discussed, and we changed it and moved on. Also, it's important to always say something you like about that person's chapter, especially again when you're sending things back and forth. You have to read their chapter to know which direction you want to take yours. Say something positive. That's your co-writer, man. Like, y'all are working on this together, especially because you are reading first draft work. Think of how nervous you get to share your first draft work with anyone, and you're going to be giving that over to your co-writer, typos and all, and they're going to have to read it in order to move on with their chapter. Just be positive and be kind, and I feel like I shouldn't need to say that, but it's not just to your co-writer but also to yourself, because as writers are so wont to do, we can see a whole lot of the negatives in our own writing, and you may look at your co-writer and be like, what they're writing is amazing, why can't I do anything like that? And they may be thinking the exact same thing about you. So why not give each other some positive encouragement? Why not? Alright, so I asked my friend what she thought some of the pros and cons of co-writing a story with your best friend are, and we hit a lot of the same things, but she did bring up some points that I haven't talked about yet that I want to emphasize. 1, the idea of a built-in idea bouncer. This is one of the best things about co-writing a story. I am so serious, especially because writing is such a solitary activity a lot of the time, and even when you then give your work to share it, you're really the one who has to then fix it and make it better and all this stuff you're doing by yourself. But now you have someone to share that with and be just as excited in that story with, and that is such a cool feeling. This is a very unique experience, and I think it is one of the best things about co-writing a story. The second thing I want to emphasize is that you now have double the network of beta readers. This is very true, but it also leads me to discuss that y'all are gonna have to have another conversation, and that is, how do I beta reader? When do you involve beta readers? What do you want from your beta readers? And how do you select beta readers? All of that needs to be a discussion that you guys have, and I might be biased because I am definitely the more conservative in this thing, but I think you have to fall back on the person who's not quite as ready to share and understand where they're coming from and just work at that rate. Of course, if someone's really dragging their feet, that's when you have another discussion where you're like, what is wrong that you don't want to share this, or you're not ready for beta readers, when clearly that's the stage we're at. Again, conversations everywhere. All the conversations! But literally double the network is an amazing thing, especially because beta readers are so hard to come by. And the third and final thing I want to emphasize, because I didn't mention it at all, is that you're gonna have to give up control. I will say now that I think this is a little bit harder on my friend because she is one of those world building, character creation types. Like, everyone has a name to her, and they have a name very early on, and she picks them very purposefully. And I think that's a great quality to have, and this kind of goes back to how I think you have to have complementary skills, but that is not something that I care about when I'm first drafting, and it's not something I'm good at either. Naming eludes me, and she's great at it. So this is a great partnership, and I let her have total control of that aspect. But also this can be really hard sometimes, especially when you're in charge of one main character, but not really the overlapping minor characters, and you're not necessarily in charge of the direction that every single thing is going to go. You guys have to give and take. This means that when there is a disagreement on the way that you're going to move forward, you need to decide how important it is to you. And if it's not that important to you, and or it involves a character that this person's kind of more in charge in, you need to just take a step back. Admit that to yourself, be like, well, I wouldn't have done that, but I'm co-writing the story. I don't have 100% of the say. And that's something you're gonna have to accept. Now, if y'all have a complete disagreement about a plot point in the future or something like that, that can be a little bit tougher. As always, it's important to explain why you think this needs to happen in the context of the story. Bring your reasons, have an open conversation, but you know, you're both gonna probably be fired up because you truly believe that this is the right way for the story to move forward, and y'all are working really hard on this, so So that's exactly why it's important to have the conversation before you even start working about how you're going to handle disagreements. I think it's also important to note that sometimes you can be too into the character, especially if you're writing exclusively their point of view, and sometimes you can want something for that character because, like actors, I think writers really have to throw themselves into it because you can feel everything for the character, not necessarily agree with it, but because you're writing the point of view of this one character, sometimes you really could be rooting for the character that you're writing, and let that cloud your judgment a little bit against what the overall story needs. So you need to take a step back, think about what's best for the story, have a conversation, and move on from there. The last thing I'm gonna mention about how to handle a disagreement is if you know about yourself that you're kind of like, not bully, but like you're definitely gonna hammer away until you kind of get what you want, or if that's something that you tend to do, and you're not conceding as much as the other person, it doesn't mean that the other person doesn't believe as strongly as you do about what they think's right or whatever. You need to take a step back. All of this is being honest with yourself. And again, if you've set up boundaries for how to cover things ahead of time, you will be in such a better place than if you're having to figure it out 2/3 of the way through the book where you're like, well, we're fucked. Alright, that's all my advice and experience that I can share with you guys on co-writing. Please comment down below and let me know if you would ever want to co-write a story or co-write a story with a friend. And if you're already co-writing, I would love to hear what you think the pros and cons of co-writing are. And then for everybody, if you think that there is any kind of story that better suits co-writers over just writing it by yourself. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon with a new video. Bye! I feel like this is gonna be so long because I wrote so many notes. Ugh. How long has that been off for? The second thing I want to emphasize is that there are bringing out that Texas accent, y'all. Hey, something.